We are, if you've been with us, we're tracking through to Easter in about 6 weeks' time. And so we want to actually see who this person of Jesus is and what he has to say and what he has to offer, what he comes to bring to the world. And so in the first week, we saw him go to his hometown, and he is rejected there by religious people. They cannot receive him because they're too familiar. This is just Jesus that's grown up among them, and so he just doesn't seem like somebody to be that significant, somebody who can't offer them that much. And so they get so angry about this that they try and throw Jesus off a cliff. Well, then in the second week, we saw how Jesus comes to Simon Peter, and for the particular purpose of wanting to call Peter to discipleship. And he meets him there in his workplace, the thing that Peter knows best, fishing. But then he calls him deeper, to call him out into the deep, to ask him to leave his nets behind and to follow him. And this morning we're going to see another encounter with Jesus. So let's just pray as we do that. Father, we do ask you now to come and minister to us through this word. Lord, your word is life, it is food, and it is refreshment for our soul. And that is what we're asking for today, that you would shine your glory upon us, that we would know your grace, that we would know your mercy from your word. And so we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. It's only when you are struggling for air that you realize how desperately you need it. I remember in primary school, the first time I got winded. It was from a heavy tackle from one of my mates in football, and I was hunched over my body and I was just wheezing. I couldn't get any air in. And it's a nightmare going through your mind. This has never happened to you before when you're a kid. And so in your mind, you're thinking, I'm awake, but I can't breathe. It's terrifying. I never realized how much I needed air until that moment. It's not until you're struggling for it that you realize how desperate you are. It's interesting, my realization for not being able to breathe was not when I couldn't, but actually when my son couldn't. I remember the first week we were in the US in 2015 when we went there to study. The very first week I woke up in the middle of the night and my wife, Michelle, sort of screamed out, "He's not breathing." And I sort of quick smart woke up. Jude, my second child, was 6 months old. He's literally not breathing for 4 or 5 seconds at a time. His airways were all blocked. This is the first week we're in America. We were just totally desperate. We were driving to the emergency room. I was trying to breathe for him. You feel your child, your son's pain so much that you're just desperate. Lord, what are you doing here? Why are we here? What are you doing in this moment? You're absolutely desperate for your child. Desperation is this feeling of hopelessness that a situation is so bad that it's almost impossible to deal with. All the options are exhausted. You think about this in your life. Think about physical illness, a wayward child, a mountain of debt, trapped in a hard marriage. Maybe you're filled with shame about your past. You need a breakthrough. Your life is a mess. And we find ourselves desperate. And it's not always obvious who is experiencing this kind of desperation, is it? Because we're very good at hiding it. We become quite expert at sort of hiding our desperation. And that does mean that today there could be some people who have come in here today who are desperate. You're feeling desperate. In fact, maybe you've come here as some kind of last-ditch effort for hope. Well, this passage, as was read out, is full of that kind of desperation. We see firstly Jairus' desperate need. You can think of Jairus as kind of like a modern-day pastor. He's a leader in the synagogue, and so he sort of prepared and organized the weekly gathering, and people knew his name, and he was well respected. But imagine that one day he arrives home at the end of the day, and his 12-year-old daughter, his only daughter, is so sick, she's so quickly fading, that she is close to death. And all of a sudden, Jairus, the one who's very familiar with other people's needs, he works in the synagogue, he's the one in desperate need himself. You think about this, can anything make you more desperate than a dying child? My daughter is 9 years old, 3 years younger than this girl. And I lie down on the carpet with my daughter in the living room and watch slime videos on YouTube. And I hate watching slime videos. I hate it. But I watch slime videos because I want to be with her. She is the absolute light of my life. I can't think of anything that would make you more desperate than if she was dying. I feel her joys, I feel her pain as if it was my own. Dads, you get me, right? Your daughter is the light of your life. This is what Jairus is experiencing right now. He is desperate. He's desperate. You know, just this week, I walked in the house after work one night, and my daughter, she was just quietly loitering around me, not saying anything. A bit unusual, a bit quiet. She's just looking at me like, Dad, we need to talk. And I asked her what was up, and I found out that this kid at school had called her the most horrible, hurtful name that day. And it totally confused her, like things she'd never really heard before or considered about herself, things that get inside a young girl's mind and wreak havoc. And she's just looking at me like, Dad, I need you. I need you. And in that moment, you feel a bit helpless about how to fix it. And internally, you are just feeling this on her behalf, and at the same time, plotting mass revenge. As a father, you are just desperate to help. You're desperate to ease the pain that you feel as deeply as she does. This was Jairus' only daughter. None of his reputation, none of his name, none of his status or position really matters in this moment. He's so desperate that he just throws himself at Jesus' feet. And if you're a Jewish man in that time, you didn't do that sort of thing. You kept your dignity intact. But he's so desperate, it's like he's begging Jesus, Jesus, you have to come. You have to come. This is my only daughter, and she's dying. Just take yourself for a moment with your own child. How desperate you would find yourself. This is Jairus' desperate need, and we see here in the text from verse 43 that Jesus begins, without much fanfare, Jesus begins to walk toward Jairus' house. But it's difficult because you see there in the text that there are crowds that are pressing all around him. They're making it difficult for them to walk freely. And so for Jairus, this is like being stuck in traffic when you're 10 minutes late. This is frustrating. Time is of the essence. Time is running out. And you imagine this in the busyness of the crowd that's kind of surging forward with Jesus there at the center. You imagine for a moment there's this woman who appears on the outskirts of the crowd, and she begins to make her way in through to where Jesus is standing in the middle. Now, crowds were not usually this woman's preference. You see, she had a condition that for 12 years meant that she suffered from a constant flow of blood. Perhaps this was a dysfunction in her menstruation. But not only was this physically debilitating for her, it meant so much more. She was considered unclean, which meant that she couldn't go to public worship gatherings at all for 12 years. She couldn't even be touched by people. And she could touch no one because then they would be considered ceremonially unclean. And so people would have thought of this woman, she was cursed. What has she done in her life to have such a curse like this? She was a social outcast. And notice as well what's not there in the text for this woman that was there for Jairus. A name. She's just woman. And so we are clearly here by Luke being given a contrast to consider. Jairus is a prominent name, And he's the leader of the synagogue. He's respected, he's looked to, and his 12-year-old daughter is dying. The woman has no name. She can't even step foot in the synagogue. And no one even looks at her because for 12 years she has suffered with a flow of blood. And the point is that desperation does not discriminate. It does not pick its victims based on your notoriety or your status or the rich or the poor or insider or outsider. Everyone gets desperate. Everyone. Tragedies and trials are the great leveler of this life. We all find ourselves desperate. And we want to do everything in our power to get out of our desperate situation. We try everything. We exhaust every option that we have set before us in order to get out of the desperate situation that we're in. And we see this in verse 43. It tells us that the woman has spent her life savings trying to get her problem fixed. She's been to physician after physician after physician, and no one can help her. She's desperate. And for Jairus in this moment, none of his notoriety or anyone with power or authority at the synagogue can help him with this problem. It's totally out of their hands. And so with every option exhausted, we see the desperate draw near to Jesus. You see this in the text. Two desperate people, and they draw near to Jesus. The woman is making her way through this surging crowd. She's hoping that nobody's going to recognize her. She's finally in reaching distance of Jesus, and she can see this tassel hanging from his cloak, which is what all the Jewish men kind of wore at that time. It represented the law of Moses. And she can see it, and she's in reaching distance of it, and she reaches out her hand to grab hold of the tassel, and all of a sudden, she feels something immediately change in her body. The flow of blood stops. You imagine what it would have been like to have this happen. 12 years she's suffered with this debilitating condition. And she's been a social outcast for 12 years. She would not be able to describe this feeling. All of a sudden, she is looking at a whole new life situation, from outcast to somebody who can be included, from untouched to somebody who can be embraced, from cursed to blessed. And she's thinking, start the car, it's time to get out of here. But not so fast. You see, Jesus also felt the power. Jesus suddenly stops and he says, "Who touched me?" You just imagine for a moment that woman freeze. I am so busted. Well, no one spoke up. And usually when there's an awkward silence in the New Testament, Peter fills it with something a little bit stupid. I love Peter. He gives me hope for myself and my own stupidity. And so he's kind of like, well, Jesus, like, everybody's touching you. You know, there's crowds all around. They're pressing all around. So, you know, everyone's touching you, and kind of let's just move on. But Jesus says, no, I felt power go out of me. It's like Jesus is a battery, and he actually felt a little bit of the charge go out from him. You know, what's happening? People have often read this text and thought, hang on, did Jesus really not know who touched him? Didn't Jesus know everything? I think what's going on here is something like what goes on in my house. Sometimes I come out to the kitchen, I find that the chocolate has been raided in the pantry. And I see two kids standing there with chocolate on their face. And so I already know who touched the chocolate, but I still asked, who touched the chocolate? The reason is that I want to give them an opportunity to confess what just happened. And that's what Jesus is doing here in verse 47. The crowds have somehow pulled back. The woman realizes that everyone knows it was her, and she's trembling. She falls down at Jesus' feet, just like Jairus did, and she begins to declare to all the people what had just happened. You see, Jesus did not want her to walk away without hearing what he says next. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. He wants her to confess all that has happened so he can assure her of what has taken place. Now, the text goes on, Jairus, you've got to have a heart for Jairus right now. He's anything but peaceful right now. Time is of the essence. And you can imagine that his desperation turns to despair because in verse 49, people arrive at his house and they say, forget about it, she's dead. In fact, the word dead in the original Greek is first in the sentence. So it's like this, dead is your daughter. There's no pastoral tone here at all. But what it does is it makes us stare at the reality of death. And what you can imagine is going through Jairus' mind here is this woman interrupting Jesus on the way to my house has just cost me the death of my daughter. If only Jesus had not delayed. And this confronts every person who becomes desperate, who wants to have faith, but faith is just slipping out of sight because God seems to delay. He doesn't seem to come. He doesn't seem to visit the side of our needs in a timely manner. And the voice in the head is like this, well, forget about it. Don't bother God anymore, it's dead. That's the voice coming into Jairus' head. Give up. And there's probably no bigger temptation when desperation goes beyond the limits than that. I give up. I quit. Jesus comes with another voice in verse 50, with his voice. And he says this, do not fear, only believe, and she will be well. And he goes with Jairus into his house and he takes his inner circle, his three, Peter, John, and James with him, as well as Jairus and his wife. And everyone outside is just weeping and mourning. In that time, the funeral started straight away. Immediately, you would hire someone to come and wail. And there would be people out the front who would wail and mourn on behalf of your family. That was the fitting thing to do. And in verse 52, Jesus says, in the midst of all of that mourning, do not weep, for she is not dead, she is sleeping. And then there's more voices coming. One we're familiar with in our own desperation in verse 53. It says that they laughed. This is more like scorn, more like mocking, cynicism. They know the situation. She's dead. The other Gospels tell us that she was dead. There's no question about that. I feel like this is that moment, like in our deep need, when someone in our life perhaps tries to ask us to reinterpret our situation, the difficult thing that we're going through, the lens of faith, to actually see it through a spiritual lens, like maybe God is doing something in your life and your heart right now, and that is what you need to see. But sometimes when you're in the midst of the pain, you're like, yeah, why don't you shut up and give me something that actually will help? Huh? What has faith got to do with what I'm dealing with? It's almost like the spiritual lens of your situation is just cold comfort. Perhaps Jairus is watching bit by bit his faith and hope fade out of sight. But then Jesus takes the little girl by the hand. He's facing here the most devastating enemy that the human race has ever known. It's death. And he simply takes the little girl by the hand and he says the words, Talitha kumi, which in English is translated something like, honey, get up. And her spirit returned and she got up at once. So what happens when the desperate draw near to Jesus? There's three things I think we see from this passage. The first thing is this. You are cleansed. You are cleansed. I remember once speaking to a woman who had experienced sexual abuse for a number of years and how she often felt this desperate need to take a shower. Because sin had touched her body over and over again, she had this desperate need to be washed. Today, in many religions, for example, Muslims and Jews, they go through a rigorous process before they pray in order to be clean before they worship. You know, there's this universal human longing for washing. Something to make you feel better about yourself than you do. It's a desperate cry in our suffering and in our guiltiness. And this text, Luke wants to show us how the unclean get clean through Jesus. You have two images of being unclean. You have a woman who is ceremonially unclean. You have a dead body. You have a corpse. Neither of these things you could touch and go and enter the worship of God. You had to stay away. You had to remain separate from God. It's not easy to make something clean, is it? It's not easy to scrub something clean. You look at the spread of the coronavirus in the world. The world's biggest problem right now is how do we scrub that thing clean? It's not easy. Because if I have a cold and I sneeze on you, then my uncleanliness has the power to infect you, so that you might catch my cold as well. But notice here the opposite happens. The unclean woman touches the pure and clean, and Jesus doesn't become impure. The woman gets made clean. And Jesus isn't made unclean by the dead body. Rather, the little girl springs to new life. See, there is a powerful cleansing of God when desperate people touch Jesus by faith. You get cleansed. You get washed of the stains of your sin. And it happens. It happened on the cross. You see, this image of this woman touching Jesus and power going out from him. This is what happens on the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, he was emptied of his power so that when you touch him by faith, he washes you. Your stain goes onto him and he makes you clean. He makes you pure. He has cleansing power over the deepest need of your soul, and that is to be washed of sin. Now, to be sure, throughout the whole of Luke, you actually see that Jesus can and he does heal physically. He cleanses physical impurities. In fact, in Luke chapter 8, you actually see this, that Luke has been showing his readers everything that Jesus has authority over. He has authority over the storm. He can calm it. He has authority over demons, everything above the world and under the world. He has authority over disease, and here we see he has authority over death, over itself. And so he has the authority and the power to cleanse your body. And so you can pray to God for healing in your body, and he may grant you a physical healing. But there is this even deeper cleansing power when you put up your hand of faith to touch Jesus, one that washes the stain of your sin, that is even deeper than your physical sicknesses. Physical sicknesses can kill you in this life, but the spiritual sickness of death and of sin will kill you forever. But the point is that only the desperate come. Only people who see their desperate need come to Jesus for cleansing. There were many people in the crowd who were touching Jesus, but the only touch that grabbed his attention was the touch of faith from a woman who was desperate, who believed if she could just touch Jesus' cloak, she would be healed. What this tells us is that you can't just hang around the crowds of religious people and think that you know God. You have to have become so desperate about the state of your soul that you are willing to reach out a hand and touch Jesus, believing that he can cleanse you from your sin. That's what saves. It's not just being in the crowd. It's not just brushing up against Jesus that we can so often do in religious communities. It's if you touch him by faith. I believe I'm in desperate need of a Savior, and he can save me. So when the desperate draw near, you are cleansed. That's good news, church. When the desperate draw near, you are cleansed. The second thing that we see when the desperate draw near is that you confess. You confess. This woman, she probably wanted to slip away, right? Imagine this trembling woman before the crowds. Crowds were her phobia. Crowds were not a place that this woman could be. But Jesus here invites her to confess. Imagine it. It says that she declares it all to the people. Imagine it. She realizes, well, everyone's looking at me now. This is the moment to say what just happened. People, for 12 years I've been hemorrhaging blood. No one's touched me. I've spent every cent I have on doctors and all kinds of remedies, and not one thing worked. But today I saw Jesus walking through, and I believed if I could just touch his cloak, then he could heal me. I didn't want to make a big deal of it. I didn't want any attention. I just knew he had the power and authority to heal me. And when I touched him, the bleeding stopped. This was like her baptism testimony. It's a common one. We heard something similar this morning. I was once hemorrhaging blood. Thank you, Courtney, for sharing that with us. I was dying on the inside. I tried everything I could to fix up my life. I tried to be a good person. I tried relationships. I tried drugs. I tried alcohol. I tried video games. I tried pornography. I tried success at work. I tried everything within me to numb the desperate pain that goes on in my soul. I tried everything. But then, by faith, I put out my hand toward Jesus, and he healed me from the inside out. He cleansed me of all my past. Did you hear that this morning? That is the hope that you have. That is the hope that we have. When you touch Jesus by faith, he cleanses. And it's so powerful and strong, but you cannot help but speak of what has happened to you. You cannot help but say, this is the man who knew everything about me, and he changed my life. When something like that made you so desperate is relieved, everything comes down and you say, all of my life is now about him. It's interesting that there's this other contrast in the passage, because for the woman, Jesus gives the opportunity to actually confess it before all. But then we see at the end of the text with Jairus, when Jesus raises his daughter from the dead, he wants them to keep quiet. There's another contrast here. One public, one keep it quiet. Why? I think the reason is because Jesus didn't want just followers whose testimony was just a physical testimony, just amazement that Jesus can heal people, not just on the surface. Jesus wanted followers with a testimony about the cleansing of sin through his own death and resurrection, which was still to come. That's what he wanted people to speak of. I was a sinner. I was destined for hell. But I met this man and I touched him by faith and he cleansed me. When the desperate draw near, he cleanses you so that you publicly confess and you don't have to fear in the midst of that. She feared, but what this story tells us is that you don't have to fear. And the reason is because of a third thing, is that when the desperate draw near, you are cared for. You are cared for. Verse 48, what's the first thing that Jesus says to this woman? She's just a woman. No name. Verse 48, he says, daughter. She's gone from this nameless woman that no one cares about or would touch to daughter. Someone loved. Jairus' dying daughter has a father to advocate for her. This woman is alone. She's exhausted her options. She's exhausted all of her life savings. But Jesus steps in and says, I can be the father you don't have. Upon your confession of what I have done for you, you are my daughter. You are my child. When the desperate draw near to Jesus, he doesn't turn you away. He doesn't turn anyone away. He's not harsh. He's not rude. He's not dismissive. As we heard this morning, he is gentle. He's compassionate. He's slow to anger. He's kind. He calls us his children. We see it here when Jesus said to the little girl, honey, get up. He directed that she be given something to eat. You see, when the desperate draw near, you are cared for. Jesus provides everything that you need. The first thing I said to my daughter this week after I put away that internal plan for mass revenge was to simply say, it's such a timely passage to be reading this week, darling, I want you to know the first things first. Jesus knows your pain. Can we, friends, teach our children not to get revenge? Teach them where to go. Teach them when hurtful names are said to them that the Father calls them daughter. Don't let them listen to that thing, to that stuff. Help them to run to Jesus because Jesus feels it. He's hurt by that this week. He doesn't want people to be called this, that injustice, that thing that's not right, that thing that is broken. Jesus understands. He calls you daughter, he calls you son. You know, many people have been put off coming to Jesus because of the harshness of people. This woman tells us that you can bring all suffering, you can bring all of your impurities to him, and he'll be gentle as a dove. And I think this tells us a few things. Don't let anyone, any harshness from any church or any person stop you from finding rest in the loving and tender arms of Christ. Come to him, and you will find him to be tender. Knowing that he's tender means that you can do what Courtney did this morning. You can share about your life, and you know what? It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks of you if the Father calls you daughter. It doesn't matter. You're totally accepted in him. You're totally set free in him. So don't let anything stop you. No sin, nothing in your past, no insecurity. Don't let anything stop you from coming to the tender arms of Christ. The second thing out of this, I believe, is church, let the desperate people through. Let them through. Don't be a crowd that blocks people from coming to touch Christ with all their brokenness, with all their impurities, with all their desperation. Let us not find ourselves to be harsh. Let us not find ourselves to be judgmental or giving certain people preference. Let the desperate through. Make a pathway through the crowd for people to be able to behold this tenderness. We have to ask ourselves, do our lives portray Jesus as harsh and dismissive? Think about your words. Think about your social media. Think about all those things. Does your life portray Jesus as harsh and dismissive? Or does your life portray Jesus as kind and gracious and ready to receive? This care that Jesus shows is actually the care that we, his church, must show to the desperate if they're going to find the loving arms of Christ. What is it that stops us getting in the way from coming to him, from drawing near to Jesus? I think we see here a couple of things. Firstly, crowds. We see delays and we see voices. Don't let crowds stop you coming to Christ. For many years of my life, I blended in with crowds. I learned the talk, the right answers. I brushed up against Jesus many, many times. But there came a point in my life, a point of desperation in my life where I had to say, all I have is Jesus. I can't hide in the pack anymore. I have to actually go to him and put my hand out towards him in faith. Don't let crowds stop you from drawing near. Second thing is delays. God just doesn't come through. And there's the overwhelming feeling of just wanting to throw your faith away. There might be some of you in this room here like that today. This overwhelming feeling, God isn't coming through in my life. Maybe I should just chuck this away. Maybe I should get a ticket to Europe. Jairus had to hold on to the words here, do not fear. When God delays, this is what we have to do. When we go through the valley of the shadow of death, we can trust in him. He has us by the hand, and we don't have to fear evil. Romans 8 gives us hope in this. It tells us that all of the trial and all the pain, all the difficulty that we suffer, even if it's a 12-year wait or longer, is just temporary. And there's eternal weight of glory to those who persevere and who know God in the midst of our trials. In the meantime, it says that even when we don't know what to pray, I don't know what to pray, Lord. I'm so broken. I'm so hurt. He groans on our behalf. He intercedes for us. And his promise is that all things work together for the good of those who love him Jesus said to this woman, "Go in peace." That wasn't just like a farewell salutation. This was the peace that Jesus came to earth for. This is the peace that the angels sang about. Peace on earth, goodwill to men. This is the right restoration of right relationship in everything. Relationship with God, relationship in your body. This is the promise for those who trust in Jesus, who know God through everything. I was challenged recently about how when trial comes in my life, I am often tempted to just want to try and go around it. And yet, Jesus wants me to go through it with him. Because the highest thing, the best thing that he knows what is good for me is to know him. To know him, that is the greatest thing, the greatest possession you can have is to know him, even in the midst of trial. The simple ingredient here for us, you see, everything in this text is about Jesus. Everything is about his authority over all things, his care, his cleansing. Everything is about him. It's not about some kind of impressive faith. All that they needed was to become desperate. It's almost a prerequisite of salvation, desperation. Realizing how desperately needy we are without him. And it occurred to me that maybe even sometimes the desperate circumstances we find ourselves in are actually a divine gift. Because they actually make us run to him. We've exhausted all our options, and we say, "Lord Jesus, all I have is you." And you touch him with faith. Maybe that difficulty that you're going through in your life is exactly that. God wants you to become desperate so that you will find him faithful. You will find his cleansing, and you will find that he cares through all the difficult seasons of your life. Let's just bow our heads. There might be some of you this morning in desperate need, and my heart goes out to you, and I don't want to do anything that would stop you this morning from coming to say, "I've been blending in, I've been listening to voices, and I've been struggling with God's delay, but I want to touch Christ with faith. I want to put out my hand and say, I trust in him." Maybe even this morning as we close, just as we sing our final couple of songs, this morning you might even see it necessary, even through fear and trembling, to just come and stand across the front here this morning, just to say, "I don't want to let anything stop me. I'm desperate, and I need Christ. And this morning I put out my hand in faith to receive him, to receive his cleansing and his care." So if you want to do that this morning, I just want to encourage you to do it. It's the best thing you could do. It's to step forward and say, "I need him. I need you, Lord." There might be some others who come this morning just to come and stand behind somebody that you know maybe, and just to put a hand on and say, "I want to stand in the gap for you and pray." So if you want to do that this morning, then I want to invite you to come. Let's all stand together.